On the other hand, the stableman's eyes bulged, and they almost danced as they demanded to know what Matt was doing. He only grinned and tossed the narrow-jawed fellow a gold mark. Just letting everybody know for sure who's come to call. He wanted Egwene to realize he was not going to be pushed around, and sometimes making people see that meant you had to act like Jack Fool. The trouble was, the banners had no effect. Oh, everybody who walked by gaped and pointed. A number of Aes Sedai came just to look, cool-eyed and expressionless. But he more than half expected an indignant demand to take them down. When he returned to the little tower, an Aes Sedai who somehow managed to be prune-faced despite smooth, ageless cheeks, shifted her brown-fringed shawl and told him in no uncertain terms that the Amelan seat was busy. Perhaps she could see him in a day or two. Perhaps. Elaine appeared to have vanished, and so did Avienda, but no one was crying murder yet. He suspected the Aiel might be somewhere having a white dress pulled over her head. All the same to him, if it kept the peace. He did not want to be the one to tell Rand one had killed the other. He did catch a sight of Nynaeve, but she ducked around a corner and was gone by the time he reached it. He spent most of the afternoon looking for Tom and Julian. Either one surely could tell him more of what was going on, and besides, he needed to apologize to Tom for his remarks about that letter. Unfortunately, nobody seemed to know where they were either. Long before nightfall, he concluded that they were being kept out of his way. Egwene really did mean for him to stew, but he intended to let her know he was not even simmering. In aid of that, he went dancing. It seemed that celebrations over a new Amelin were supposed to go on for a month, and though everyone in Saladar seemed to be working at a run during the day, once darkness fell, bonfires were lit at every street crossing, and fiddles and flutes appeared, and even a dulcimer or two. Music and laughter filled the air, and festival reigned until bedtime. He saw Aes Sedai dancing in the streets, with carters and stablemen still in their rough clothes, and warders dancing with serving women, and cooks who had put aside their aprons. No Egwene, though. The Amerlin bloody seat was not going to caper in the streets. No Elaine or Nynaeve either, and no Tom or Julian. Tom would not have missed a dance with both legs broken, unless he was deliberately kept away. Matt settled down to enjoy himself, to let everybody see he had not a care in the world. It did not work exactly as he wished. He danced a short time with the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life, a slim yet buxom armful who wanted to know all about Matt Cawthon. Very flattering, especially when she had asked him to step out. But after a while he noticed that Halima had a way of brushing against him, a way of leaning to look at something so he could not help seeing down her dress. He might have enjoyed it if not for the fact that she glanced at his face every time with a sharp eye and an amused smile. She was not a very good dancer. She kept trying to lead, for one thing, and he finally begged off. It should have been nothing, but before he had gone 10 paces, the foxhead went icy cold on his chest. He spun around, looking curiously for anything at all. What he saw was Halima staring at him in the firelight. Only for an instant before she seized a tall warder's arm and whirled back into the dance, but he was sure he had seen shock on that beautiful face. The fiddles were wailing a tune he recognized. At least one of his old memories did. Not very much changed, considering the passage of well over 1,000 years. The words must have changed altogether, for the old words that echoed in his head would never have found favor here.
Have something
Give me your trust, said the Aes Sedai. On my shoulders I support the sky. Trust me to know and to do what is best, and I will take care of the rest. But trust is the color of a dark seed growing. Trust is the color of a heart's blood flowing. Trust is the color of a soul's last breath. Trust is the color of death. Aes Sedai, a plump young woman said contemptuously to his question. She was pretty, and he might have tried for a bit of a kiss and cuddle in different circumstances. Halima's just Delana Sedai's secretary, always teasing the men, she is, like a child with a new toy, teasing just to see if she can. She'd be in hot water to her neck 10 times over if Delana didn't protect her.
Is it a good harvest?
Give me your
Nice.
trust,
Top
said the
shelf.
queen on her throne,
That's
or I
always
must
good.
bear the burden all alone. Trust me to lead and to judge and to rule, and no man will think you a fool. But trust is the sound of the grave dog's bark. Trust is the sound of betrayal in the dark. Trust is the sound of a soul's last breath. Trust is the sound of death. Maybe he had been mistaken. Maybe she had just been shocked that he walked off. Not many men would walk away from a woman who looked like that, no matter how she teased or danced. That had to be it. But that left the question of who and why. He looked around at the dancers and the people watching from the edge of the shadows and waiting their turns. The golden-haired hunter for the horn, who seemed familiar when spinning by with a particularly lumpy-faced fellow, her braid almost standing out behind her. Matt could pick out Aes Sedai by their faces. Most of them he could, but there was no way to tell which had tried to... whatever it was she had tried. He strode on down the street to the bonfire, as much to get away from that song as anything. But it went on through The King on High and The Lady and Lord to The Love of Your Life in his head. In that old memory, he remembered writing that song because of the love of his life. Trust is the taste of death. At that next corner, a fiddler and a woman with a flute were playing what sounded like Fluff the Feathers, a good country dance. How far could he trust Egwene? She was Aes Sedai now. She must be if she was Amerlin, even a ragtag Amerlin in a ragtag village. Well, whatever she was Egwene. He could not believe she would strike at him out of the dark that way. Of course, Nynaeve might, though not to injure him, really. His hip still hurt, though. The bruise had made a knot. And the White only knew what a woman like Elaine might do. They were still trying to chase him away, he decided. He could probably expect more attempts. The best thing was to ignore them. He almost hoped they did try again. They could not touch him with the power, and the more they tried and failed, why, the more they would have to see he was not to be budged. Morella came to stand beside him, watching the dancers. He remembered her vaguely. He did not think she knew anything dangerous about him. He did not think so. She was not as beautiful as Halima, of course, but still much more than merely pretty. Flickering shadows washed her face, so he could almost forget she was Aes Sedai. A warm night, she said, smiling, and went on in such a casual way while he enjoyed looking at her that it took him some time to realize what she was getting at. I don't think so, he said politely when she gave an opening. This was what came of forgetting. Aes Sedai were Aes Sedai. She only smiled. There would be many advantages, and I would not try to pin you to my skirts. Many advantages. You've chosen a perilous life, or had it chosen for you. A warrior
Nice.
might have a better chance
Yeah,
of
solar
survival.
panels would definitely help out.
I really don't think so. No, but thank you for the offer. Think on it, Matt. Unless... Has the Amerlin bonded you? No. Egwene would not do that. Would she? She could not, so long as he wore the medallion. But would she if he did not have it? If you will excuse me. He gave her a shallow bow and walked quickly to where a pretty blue-eyed young woman was tapping her foot to the music. She had a sweet mouth, just right for kissing, and he bloody well wanted to enjoy himself. I saw your eyes, and I couldn't help coming over. Will you dance? Too late he saw the great serpent ring on her right hand, and then that sweet mouth opened, and a voice he recognized said dryly, I asked you once whether you'd be there when the house was burning down, boy, but it seems you make a habit of jumping into fires. Now go away and find somebody who wants to dance with you. She was stilled and dead. She was glaring at him with some young woman's face she had stolen, was what she was, and wearing an Aes Sedai ring. He had asked Swan Sanche to dance. While he was still staring, a willowy young Domani woman swirled up in a pale green dress, thin enough for for the light of the bonfire to silhouette her through it. Giving Swan a frosty look that was returned with interest, the Damani all but snatched him out among the dancers. She was as tall as an Aiel woman, dark eyes actually a little higher than his. "I am Leanna, by the way," she said in a voice like a honeyed caress, "in case you did not recognize me." Her low laugh was almost a caress, too. He jumped and nearly fumbled the first turn. She also wore the ring. He moved by rote. Tall or not, she was a feather in his hands, a gliding swan. But that was certainly not enough to stop the question that kept popping in his head like an illuminator's firework. Ow. The light? To top it all, when the dance was done, she said, "Oh, good dancer," in a stroking voice, and then kissed him about as thoroughly as he had ever been kissed. He was so shocked he did not even try to get away. Sighing,
Well, in
she patted his
this, I'm
cheek.
smoking
"A very good dancer.
I think it was
Think of it as dancing next
that
time."
something pound cake, but it was a butter or batter, whatever they
And
call
off
it.
she went laughing, back into the dance with some fellow she snagged from the onlookers. Matt decided he had had as much as one man could take in a night. He went back to the stable and went to sleep with his saddle for a pillow. His dreams were involved Morella and Swan and Liana and Halima. When it came to dreams, the man just naturally lacked the sense to pour water out of the boot. The next day had to be better, he thought, especially when Dawn found Bannon in the loft asleep on his saddle. Talmanis understood and would hold where he was. The warders had been seen watching the band's preparations, no doubt letting themselves be seen, but no one had come near the band. A less pleasant surprise was finding Olver's Gray in the yard behind the stable, and Olver himself curled up in his blankets in a corner.
Hell yeah.
"You need somebody to watch your back," he
I'm
told
smoking
Matt. "She cannot
roaches
be
right
trusted."
now.
There was no need for him to name Avienda. Oliver had no interest in playing with the children in the village, so Matt had to endure the stares and smiles as the boy trailed him around Salidar, doing his best to imitate a warder's flowing stride and looking 9 ways at once for Avienda, who was still nowhere to be seen any more than Elaine and Inez. And the Amerlin was still busy.
I guess the
Tom and
upside of
Julian were
smoking
also
roaches is
busy.
I got
Bannon
wax to
managed to do
smoke,
a few
so
things, but nothing
I could
that made
throw
Matt
some wax
happy.
on top of the bowl of roaches and
If
make
Nynaeve
it
had
even
really
better.
healed Swan and Liana, she would
But
be
the
worse than
roaches,
ever. She had always had a large
they
opinion
definitely
of
help
herself,
out
and
on
after doing what could not be
helping
done, her
someone
head would
sleep
be
at
bigger
night.
than
They
a
definitely
Jew
help me
melon.
sleep at night.
Yet that was the mildest of it. Logain and the Red Aja made Matt wince. That sounded the sort of thing no psychiatrist would give. If Squire Bryn was leading their army, it was no mob of farmers and street sweepings, with a few warders for stiffening. Add in the foodstuffs Bannon saw being wrapped or stuck in barrels for travel, and it sounded like trouble. The worst kind of trouble Matt could imagine, short of finding one of the Forsaken across the table from him, and a dozen Trollocs coming in the door. None of it made them any less fools. It made them very dangerous fools. Tom and his help them make it work. If the Gleeman ever came out of hiding, maybe he could pull a how out of one of his tales. In the evening, Morella spoke to him again about becoming a warder, and went a little tight around the eyes when he told her hers would be the 5th offer he had refused since sunup. He was not sure she believed him. She flounced off in as much of a huff as he had ever seen from an Aes Sedai. It was true, though. The very first, while he was still trying to eat breakfast, had been the very Delana that Halima worked for, a stout, pale-haired woman with watery blue eyes who came close to trying to bully him into it. That night he stayed away from the dancing and went to sleep with music and laughter in his ears. They sounded sour this time. It was mid-afternoon of his second full day in Salidar. A girl in a white dress, pretty and freckled and working very hard at an icy dignity that she almost reached, found him with a summons, and it was exactly that. "You will present yourself before the Amerlin seat at once." Full stop, and not another word. Matt motioned to her to lead. It seemed proper, and she seemed to like doing it. They were all there in that room in the little tower, Egwene and Nynaeve, Elaine and Avienda, though he had to look twice to recognize the Aiel woman in a blue dress of fine wool with a lace collar and cuffs. At least neither Avienda nor Elaine was trying to strangle the other, but they were both stony-faced, which made them no different than Egwene and Nynaeve. Not a flicker of expression in the four, and all eyes on him. He managed to hold his tongue while Egwene laid out his choices as she saw them, sitting behind the table with that striped stole draped on her shoulder. "Should you think you can do neither," she finished, "remember that I can have you tied to your horse and returned to your band of the hand. There is no room in Saladar for slackers and malingerers. I will not allow it. For you, Matt, it's either Abu Dar with Elaine and Nynaeve, or off to see who you can impress with flags and banners." Which really left no choice at all, of course. When he said so, nobody's expression changed. If anything, Nynaeve grew more wooden. And Egwene just said, "I'm glad that is done, Matt. Now I have 1,000 things to do. I will try to see you before you go." Dismissed like a stable boy, the Amerlin was busy. The least she could have done was toss him a copper. That was why Matt's third morning in Saladar found him just outside it, on the cleared ground, between village and forest. "They may stay right here till I get back," he told Talmanis, glancing over his shoulder toward the houses. They would be coming soon, and he did not want any of this getting back to Egwene. She would try to drive a spike through it if she could. "I hope so, anyway. If they move, follow wherever they go, but never close enough to frighten. And if a young woman named Egwene shows up, you ask no questions, just take her and ride to Camelin if you have to cut a hole through Garth Bryn." Of course, he might be intending to go to Camelin. There might be a chance. He was afraid it was Tar Valon they were aiming at, though. Tar Valon and the headsman's axe. "And take Niram with you." Talmanis shook his head. "If you are taking Nelisian, I will be offended if you do not let me send my man to care for your things." Matt wished Talmanis would smile once in a while. It would help to know when he was serious. He certainly sounded serious. Niram stood a little distance off with Pips, and his own short, plump brown mare towering over him, and two pack horses with wicker panniers stuffed to the top. Nelisian's man, a stout fellow named Lopin, only led one pack animal in addition to his hammer-nosed gelding, and Nelisian's tall black stallion. That was not all the party. No one seemed ready to tell him more than where to be and when, but in the middle of yet another talk about becoming a warder, Morella had let him know it was now all right for him to communicate with the band, so long as he did not try to bring them nearer Saladar. That had been the last thing in his mind. Bannon was there this morning because he could probably spy out the lay of the land anywhere, and a dozen cavalrymen chosen from the band for heavy shoulders and having kept order well as Red Arms back in Mehron. From what Nelisian said, quick fists and cudgels should be able to quell any inconvenience Nynaeve and Elaine got into, at least long enough to spirit them away. Last of all was Alvar, on the gray he had named Wind, which the leggy animal might even deserve. Alvar had been no hard choice. The band might well find trouble if they actually had to follow that lot of mad women. Maybe not trouble with Bryn, but enough nobles would bristle at two armies crossing their lands to provide nightly attempts at the horses and arrows flying from every second thicket. Any city had to be safer than that for a boy. Still no sign of any Aes Sedai, and the sun beginning to bake above the treetops. Matt jerked his hat down irritably. "Nelisian knows Abu Dar, Talmanis." The Tyran grinned through his sweat and nodded. Talmanis's face did not change. "Oh, all right. Niram comes." Talmanis inclined his head. Maybe he had been serious. At last there was a stir in the village. A group of women leading horses.
Didn't go too
Not
good.
just Elaine and Nynaeve, though he had not
I had
expected
to
anyone
pull the
else.
one I had growing outside.
Avienda wore a gray riding
because
dress,
it was
but
a
she
loss.
looked at her lean dun mare more than doubtfully. That hunter with
But
the
they didn't
golden
do too
braid
good this
showed
year
more
just because
confidence with a heavy-haunched, mouse-colored gelding
really old
and seemed to
soil
be
that we're
trying to
using.
convince Avienda of something about her mare. What was either of them doing here?
So
There
I
were
mean,
two
really old
Aes Sedai
soil
as
kind of
well.
sucks.
Other Aes Sedai besides Nynaeve and Elaine, he supposed he should say. Slender women with white hair, which he had not seen on an Aes Sedai before. An old fellow trailed after them with a pack horse in addition to his own mount, a stringy man without much hair and that gray. It took Matt a moment to realize he was a warder, with one of those color-shifting cloaks hanging down his back. That was what being a warder meant. Aes Sedai worked you till your hair fell out, and probably worked your bones after you were dead. Tom and Julian came not far behind, and they had a pack horse too. The women stopped some 50 paces to the left with their aged warder, not so much as looking at Matt and his men. The gleeman glanced at Nynaeve and the others, then spoke to Julian, and they led their horses toward Matt, stopping short as if uncertain of their welcome. Matt went to them. "I have to apologize, Matt," Tom said, knuckling his mustaches. "Elaine put it in no uncertain terms that I wasn't to talk with you further. She only relented this morning. In a weak moment some months back, I promised to follow her orders, and she flings it in my face at the most awkward times. She wasn't very pleased that I had said as much as I did." "Nynaeve threatened to punch my eye if I went near you," Julian said glumly, leaning on his bamboo staff. He was wearing a red Tarabonner cap that could not give much protection from the sun, and even that looked glum. Matt looked toward the women. Nynaeve was peeking at him over her saddle, but when she saw him looking, she ducked behind her horse, a plump brown mare. He would not have thought even Nynaeve could beat Julian down, but the dark thief-taker was a far cry from the man he had known briefly in Tyr. That Julian had been ready for anything. This Julian, with a permanent furrowed brow, looked as if he never stopped worrying. "We will teach her some manners this trip, Julian. Tom, I'm the one who has to apologize. What I said about the letter. It was the heat talking, and worry over fool women. I hope it was good news." Too late he remembered what Tom had said. He had left the woman who wrote that letter to die. But Tom only shrugged. Matt did not know what to make of him without his gleeman's cloak. "Good news? I haven't puzzled that out yet. Often you don't know whether a woman is friend, enemy, or lover until it is too late. Sometimes she is all three." Matt expected a laugh, but Tom frowned and sighed. "Women always seem to like making themselves mysterious, Matt. I can give you an example. Do you remember Aludra?" Matt had to think. "The illuminator we kept from getting her throat slit in Arngil." "The very one. Julian and I met her during our travels, and she didn't know me. Not that she failed to recognize me. You say things to a stranger you travel with to get to know them. Aludra did not want to know me, and even if I didn't know why, I saw no reason to impose. I met her a stranger and left her a stranger. Now, would you call her a friend or an enemy?" "Maybe a lover," Matt said dryly. He would not mind meeting Aludra again. She had given him some fireworks that proved very useful. "If you want to know about women, ask Perrin, not me. I don't know anything at all. I used to think Rand knew, but Perrin surely does." Elaine was talking with the two white-haired Aes Sedai under the hunter's watchful eye. One of the older Aes Sedai gazed in Matt's direction consideringly. They had the same sort of bearing Elaine did, cool as a queen on her bloody throne. "Well, with luck, I won't have to put up with them long," he muttered to himself. "With luck, whatever they're doing won't take long, and we can be back here in 5 or 10 days. With luck, he might be back before the band had to begin shadowing the madwomen. Tracking not one army but two would be easy as stealing a pie, of course, but he did not look forward to any more days in Elaine's company than necessary. 10 days, Tom said. "Matt, even with this gateway, it will take 5 or 6 just to reach Abu Dar." Better than 20 or so, but... Matt stopped listening. Every shred of irritation that had been building since he first laid eyes on Egwene again came to a head at once. Snatching off his hat, he stalked to where Elaine and the others were. Keeping him in the dark was bad enough. How was he supposed to keep them out of trouble when they told him nothing? But this was ridiculous. Nynaeve saw him coming and darted behind her mare for some reason. "It will be interesting traveling with the ta'veren," one of the white-haired Aes Sedai said. Up close, he still could not fasten any age to her, yet somehow her face conveyed an impression of long years. It must have been the hair. She could have used the other for a mirror. Maybe they really were sisters. "I am Vandine Nemela." Matt was in no mood to talk about being ta'veren. He was never in that mood, but certainly not now. "What's this nonsense I hear about 5 or 6 days to reach Ebou Dar?" The old warder straightened, staring hard, and Matt reevaluated him as well. Stringy but hard as old roots. It made no difference in his tone. "You can open a gateway inside of Ebou Dar. We aren't any bloody army to scare anyone. And as for popping out of air, you're Aes Sedai. People expect you to pop out of air and walk through walls." "I fear you are speaking to the wrong one of us," Vandine said. He looked at the other white-haired woman, who shook her head as Vandine said, "No, Adelius, I fear. It appears we are not strong enough for some of the new things." Matt hesitated, then settled his hat low and turned to Elaine. Her chin came up. "Apparently you know rather less than you believe, Master Cawthon," she said coolly. She was not sweating, he realized. No more than the other two, Aes Sedai. The hunter was staring at him challengingly. What had put a bee in her ear? "There are villages and farms around Ebou Dar for 100 miles, Elaine went on, explaining the obvious to a fool. "A gateway is quite dangerous. I do not intend to kill some poor man's sheep or cows, much less the poor man himself." He hated more than her tone. She was right, and he hated that too. He was not about to admit she was, though, not to her, and searching for a way to retreat, he saw Egwene coming out of the village with 24 or more Aes Sedai, most wearing fringed shawls. Or rather, she came and they followed. Head held high, she looked straight ahead, that striped stole hanging about her neck. The others strolled along behind her in little clumps. Shiriam, wearing the blue keeper's stole, was talking with Morella and a bluff-faced Aes Sedai who managed to look motherly. Except for Delana, he recognized none of the others. One had gray hair and a bun. How old did Aes Sedai have to be for their hair to go completely gray or white? But they were all talking among themselves, ignoring the woman they had named Amerlin. Egwene might as well have been alone. She looked alone. Knowing her, she was trying very hard to be what they had named her. And they let her walk alone with everybody watching. To the pit of doom with them if they think they can treat a Two Rivers woman that way, he thought grimly. Striding to meet Egwene, he swept off his hat and bowed, making the best leg he knew how. And he could flourish with the best when he had to. "Good morning, Mother, and the light shine on you," he said, loud enough to be heard in the village. Kneeling, he seized her right hand and kissed her great serpent ring. A quick glare and a grimace directed at Talmanis and the others, and hidden by Egwene from those behind her, had them all scrambling to kneel and call out, "The light illumine you, Mother," or some variation, even Tom and Julian. Egwene looked startled at first, though she hid it quickly. Then she smiled and said softly, "Thank you, Matt." For a moment he stared up at her, then cleared his throat and stood, brushing off his knees. Shiriam and all those others behind Egwene were staring at him. "I didn't expect you out here," he said in a low voice, "but then it seems there are all sorts of things I didn't expect. Does the Amerlin always see people off on trips? You wouldn't by any chance want to tell me what it's all about now, would you?" At first he thought she might. Then her mouth tightened for an instant, and she gave a slight shake of her head. I will always see friends off, Matt. I'd have spoken with you before this if I was not so busy. Matt, do try to stay out of trouble in Abu Dar. He stared indignantly. Here he went kneeling and kissing rings, and she told him to stay out of trouble when the whole point was for him to keep Elaine and Nynaeve with whole skins. I will try, Mother, he said wryly, but not too. Shiriam and some of those might be close enough to hear. If you'll excuse me, I must see to my men. Another bow, and he backed away a few steps before stalking over to where Talmanis and the rest were still on their knees. Do you mean to stay there till you take root? He growled. Mount up! He followed his own order, and everyone but Talmanis scrambled into their saddles. Egwene passed a few words with Elaine and Nynaeve, while Vandine and Adelius went to speak to Shiriam. And then it was time. As quick as that, after all their dawdling. I expected some sort of ceremony, laying there in the Amran stole, but she and the others, who were not going, merely withdrew a little distance. Elaine stepped out, and suddenly there was a slash of light in front of her, widening into a hole. The view through it, what seemed to be a low hilltop covered in brown grass, rotating to a halt, just like when Rand did it. Almost. Dismount, Matt ordered. Elaine looked quite pleased with herself. You would never suspect the sort of woman she was from that delighted smile, asking Nynaeve and Avienda to share her pleasure. But pleased or not, the plate was not as large as the one Rand had made for the band. Of course, there were not nearly so many as the band. But the least she could have done was make it tall enough to ride through. On the other side, low, rolling brown grass hills ran as far as Matt could see, even when he climbed back onto Pips, though a darkness to the south suggested forest. Dusty hills. We must not press the horses too hard in this, Adelius said, swinging quite easily onto her round bay mare as soon as the gateway vanished. The animal looked as if it would be more at home in a barn. Oh, indeed not, Vandine said. Her mount was a slab-sided black gelding that had a light step. The pair of them started south, motioning everyone to follow. The old warder rode right at their heels. Nynaeve and Elaine exchanged irritated looks, then booted their mares to catch the older women, hooves beating up dust until they were level. The yellow-braided hunter dogged them the way the warder did the other pair. Sighing, Matt undid the black kerchief around his neck and retied it over his nose and mouth. Much as he might enjoy seeing the older Aes Sedai teach those two to sit up straight, what he really wanted was an uneventful ride, a short stay in Abu Dar, and a quick jump back to Saladar before Egwene did anything stupid and irretrievable. Women always gave him trouble. He did not understand it.
When the gateway winked out, Egwene sighed. Maybe Elaine and Nynaeve between them could keep Matt from getting into too much trouble. Keeping him out entirely was probably too much to ask. She felt a pang of regret for using him, but he might be some use where he was, and he had had to be gotten away from the band. Besides, he deserved it. Maybe Elaine would teach him a few manners. Turning to the others, the Hall and Shiriam and her circle, she said, "Now we must get on with what we're about." All eyes went to the Cairhienin in the dark coat, just now mounting his horse near the trees. Talmanis, Egwene thought Matt had said his name was. She had not dared ask too many questions. He studied them for a moment and shook his head before riding into the forest. "A man who means trouble if I ever saw one," Romanda said. Lelaine nodded. "It will be well to put miles between ourselves and that sort." Egwene did not let herself smile. Matt's band had served its first purpose, but a great deal depended on exactly what orders Matt had left with this Talmanis. She thought she could depend on Matt in this. Swan said that man Vanin had rooted out things before she had a chance to put them under his nose, and if she was to come to her senses and run to the band for protection, then the band would have to be close to her. "Shall we go to our horses?" she said. "If we leave now, we should catch up to Lord Brynwell before sunset."
Chapter 45. A Bitter Thought. As Vilnar led his mounted patrol through the streets of the new city, not far from the tall outer city wall, its gray stone streaked with silver and white in the midday sun, he thought about shaving his beard. Some others already had shaved, even if everyone said the heat was unnatural. It must be cooler back in Saldaea. Letting his thoughts roam was safe enough. He could guide his horse in his sleep, and only the most foolhardy cutpurse would ply his trade anywhere near 10 Saldaeans. They rode about at random, so the fellows would not know where they were safe. In truth, more often than having to catch thieves, they merely arrested those who came to them. The toughest bully boy in Camelin would come running for Saldaeans to take him up before the Aiel could. So Vilnar kept half an eye on the street and let his mind drift. He thought about the girl back home in Mehar he would like to marry. Terriane's father was a merchant and wanted a soldier for a son, perhaps more than Terriane wanted one for a husband. He thought about the game those Aiel women had suggested. Maiden's Kiss sounded innocent enough, but there had been a gleam in their eyes he did not quite trust. Most of all, though, he thought about Aes Sedai. Vilnar had always wanted to see an Aes Sedai, and certainly there could be no better place than Camelin now, unless he went to Tarvalin one day. Apparently, there were Aes Sedai all over Camelin. He had ridden to Culain's Hound, where rumor had 100, but at the last moment he could not make himself go in. He was brave enough with a sword in his hand and a horse between his knees, and men or Trollocs in front of him. But the thought of Aes Sedai turned him shy. Besides, the inn would not have accommodated 100 women, and none of the girls he saw could possibly be Aes Sedai. He had gone to the Crown of Roses, too, and watched from across the street, but he was not sure any of the women he had seen was Aes Sedai, and that made him sure they were not. He cocked an eye at a thin woman with a wide nose coming out of a tall house that must belong to a merchant. She stood frowning at the street before finally donning a wide-brimmed straw hat and hurrying off. Vilnar shook his head. He could not have said how old she was, but that was not enough. He knew how to recognize an Aes Sedai. Let Jidar claim they were so beautiful they could kill a man by smiling, and let Rissyn insist they were all a foot taller than any man. Vilnar knew it was the face you could tell by. The timeless face of an immortal. It must be impossible to mistake that. As the patrol came opposite the towered vaulting arch of the White Bridge Gate, Vilnar forgot about Aes Sedai. Outside, one of the farmers' markets stretched alongside the road, long open stone sheds, roofed in red or purple tiles, pens full of calves and pigs and sheep, chickens and ducks and geese, stalls selling everything from beans to turnips. Usually those markets were a cacophony of farmers crying their wares, but now, except for the clamor of the animals, silence marched along the market toward the gate, beside one of the oddest processions Vilnar had ever seen. A long column of farmers, 4 abreast, on horseback, made the bulk of it, and there seemed to be wagons behind. Farmers for sure in those rough coats, but every one of them in Vilnar's sight had the longest bow he had ever seen slung across his back, a full quiver at one hip and a long knife or short sword at the other. Leading the procession was a white banner bordered in red with a red wolf's head, and a mix of people as odd as the column. There were 3 Aiel, afoot of course, 2 of them maidens, and a fellow whose bright green-striped coat and virulent yellow breeches said he was a tinker, except he had a sword on his back. He was leading a horse as big as a Nashun draft horse, with a saddle meant for a giant. The leader seemed to be a heavy-shouldered, shaggy-haired fellow with a short beard and a wicked axe on his belt. And at his side rode a Saldaean woman in dark, narrow, divided skirts who kept looking up at him with the fondest... Vilnar sat forward in his saddle. He recognized that woman. He thought of Lord Bashir in the royal palace right that moment. More, he thought of Lady Dira, and his heart sank. She was in the palace, too. If some Aes Sedai had waved her hand and turned that column into Trollocs, Vilnar would have been overjoyed. Maybe this was the price for daydreaming. Had he kept his mind on his duty, the patrol would have been long past here by now. Still, he had his orders. Wondering whether Lady Dira would have his head for a ball, he deployed his men in the gate. Perrin let his dun stallion walk within 10 paces of the city gate before drawing rein. Stepper was as happy to stop. He did not like the heat. The mounted men blocking the gate were Saldaeans, by those bold noses and tilted eyes. Some wore glossy black beards, some thick mustaches, and some were clean-shaven. Every man save one had a hand on his sword hilt. The air stirred from them, not quite a breeze. There was no fear smell. Perrin looked at Fail, but she was bent over Swallow's arched neck, intent on fiddling with the black mare's bridle. She smelled faintly of herbal soap and anxiety. They had heard news of Saldaeans in Camelin these last 200 miles and more, led by Fail's father, supposedly. That did not seem to worry Fail, but she was certain her mother would be in Camelin as well. She said that did not worry her either. "We don't even need the bowman," Aram said quietly, stroking the hilt that stuck up over his shoulder. His dark eyes seemed eager. He certainly smelled eager. "There are only 10. You and I could cut through them ourselves." Gaul had veiled himself, and almost certainly Bane and Chiad had too, on the other side of Fail. "No archers and no cutting," Perrin said, "and no spears, Gaul." He did not say anything to Bane or Chiad. They only listened to Fail anyway, who did not appear ready to look up or say a word any time soon. Gaul merely lowered his veil with a shrug. Aram frowned in disappointment. Perrin kept his expression mild as he turned back to the Saldaeans. Yellow gold eyes made some men nervous. "My name is Perrin Ebara. I think Randall Thor will want to see me." The bearded fellow who had not touched his sword gave a small bow from the saddle. "I am Vilna Barada, Lord Ebara. Under-Lieutenant, sword sworn to Lord Davram Bashir." He said that very loudly. Come to think of it, he had been avoiding looking at Fail. She sighed at mention of her father and scowled at Barada, the more so when he continued to ignore her. "Lord Bashir's orders," the man went on, adding as an afterthought, "and the Lord Dragon's, are that no noble can enter Camelin with more than 20 armed men or 50 servants." Aram shifted on his horse. He was even more prickly about Perrin's supposed honor than Fail, which was saying something. But thank the light, he would not unsheath his sword unless Perrin said to. Perrin spoke over his shoulder. "Daniel, take everybody back to that meadow we passed about 3 miles back, and make camp. If a farmer shows up to complain, give him some gold and smooth him down. Let him know he'll be paid for any damage. Aram, you go with them." Daniel Lewin, a beanpole of a man with a thick mustache that almost hit his mouth, knuckled his forehead despite all the times Perrin had told him a simple "all right" would do, and immediately began giving orders to turn everyone around. Aram stiffened, of course. He never liked being far from Perrin. But he said nothing, equally of course. Sometimes Perrin thought he had acquired a wolfhound in the former tinker. Not good for a man to be that way, but he did not know what to do about it. He expected Fail to say a good deal about sending everyone back. He expected her to bring up what was due his so-called position, and insist on the 20 Barada had mentioned, and as close to the 50 as they could manage as well. But she was leaning out of her saddle to speak in whispers with Bane and Chiad. He made a point of not listening, though he could still make out parts of words. Something about men, sounding amused. Women always seemed either amused or angry when they talked of men. Fail was the reason he had all these people trailing after him, and the banner to boot, though he had not yet figured out exactly how she had done it. There were servants back in the wagons, men and women wearing livery with a wolf's head on the shoulder. Even the Two Rivers folk had not complained. They seemed as proud of it as any of the refugees. "Does that satisfy?" he asked Barada. "You can escort the rest of us to Rand, if you don't want us running loose." I think... Barada's dark eyes darted to Fail and away. I think that would be best. As Fail straightened, Bane and Chiad trotted to the line of horsemen and pushed through as if they were not there. The Saldeans did not even look surprised, but then they must be used to Aiel. All the rumors said Camelin was full of Aiel already. I must find my spear brothers, Gaul said abruptly. May you always find water and shade, Peranebara. And away he darted after the women. Fail hid an amused smile behind a gray-gloved hand. Perrin shook his head. Gaul wanted Chiad to marry him, but by Aiel custom, she had to ask him. And though according to Fail she was willing to become his lover, she would not give up the spear and marry. He seemed as affronted as a Two Rivers girl would have been in the same circumstance. Bane seemed to be part of it too, somehow. Perrin did not understand how. Fail professed not to know, if a bit too quickly, and Gaul grew sullen when asked. An odd people. The Saldeans made a way through the crowds, but Perrin paid little mind to crowds or city. He had seen Camelin once, some of it, and he did not much like cities anymore. Wolves seldom came close to a city. He had not sensed one for 2 days. What he did do was study his wife, with sideways looks, trying not to let her notice. He might as well have stared. She always rode erect, but now she was stiff in her saddle, glaring at Barada's back. The man's shoulders were hunched as if he could feel her eyes. A falcon could not glare as well as Fail. Perrin expected she was thinking of the same thing as he, though maybe not along the same lines. Her father. She might have a few explanations to make. She had run away, after all, to become a hunter for the Horn. But Perrin was the one who had to face the Lord of Bashir, Tyr, and Sedona and tell the man a blacksmith had married his daughter and heir. It was not something Perrin looked forward to. He did not think he was particularly brave. Doing what you had to do was not bravery. But he had never really thought he might be a coward until now. The thought of Fail's father dried his mouth. Maybe he should see to setting up the camp. A letter sent to Lord Bashir could explain everything. A carefully composed letter might take 2 or 3 days to write. Maybe more.
Excuse me.
He was no hand with words. A glimpse of the crimson banner waving lazily above the royal palace brought him back with a thump. The rumors had spoken of that. Perrin knew it was not the dragon banner, whatever the rumors said. Some claimed it meant the Aes Sedai served Rand, others that he served them. And he wondered why Rand was not flying the dragon banner itself. Rand. He could still feel Rand pulling at him, Greater Ta'Viren tugging at Lesser. It did not tell him where Rand was. It was not that kind of pull. He had left the Two Rivers expecting to ride to Tyr, or maybe the light alone knew where, and only a river of rumors and tales flowing west across Andor had brought him here. Some very disturbing tales and rumors. No, what he felt was more a need to be near Rand, or maybe Rand's need for him. Like an itch between his shoulders he could not scratch. Now it was close to being scratched, and he almost wished it was not. He had a dream, one that Fail would laugh at, adventurous as she was. He dreamed of living in a small house with her, somewhere in the country, far from cities and strife. There was always strife around Rand. But Rand needed him, and he would do what he had to. In a great column-ringed courtyard overlooked by marble balconies and pointed spires, Perrin slung his belt, weighted by his axe, on the saddle. It was a relief to be rid of it for a while, and a white-robed man and woman took Stepper and Swallow. With a few words, Barada turned Fail and him over to cold-eyed Aielmen, many wearing scarlet headbands marked with the black and white disc, who led them inside, and with even fewer words handed them to maidens who were just as frosty. Perrin did not recognize any of them from the stone, and his efforts at making conversation were met with blank looks. Their hands flashed maiden hand talk, and one was chosen out to take him and Fail deeper into the palace. a lean, sandy-haired woman he thought might be about Fail's age. She named herself Larian, the only words she spoke, except to warn them not to wander. He wished Bane or Chihad were there. A familiar face would have been pleasant. Fail glided down the corridors like the grand lady she was, yet at every crossing hallway she looked both ways quickly. Plainly, she did not want to be surprised by her father. Finally, they reached a pair of doors, each carved with a lion, where two more maidens rose from squatting on their heels, and still more hand-talk flickered before the sandy-haired maid went in without knocking. Aaron was wondering whether it was always like this around Rand now. Aiel guards and nobody speaking, when suddenly the doors were flung open and there was Rand in his shirt sleeves. "Aaron! Fail! The lights shine on your wedding day," he laughed, kissing Fail lightly. "I wish I could have been there for it." She looked as confused as Perrin felt. "How did you know?" he exclaimed, and Rand laughed again, clapping him on the shoulder. "Bode's here, Perrin. Bode and Jancy and all of them. In Camelin, anyway. This is as far as Varen and Alana got them before they heard about the tower." He looked tired, his eyes drawn, though his laughter did not sound it. "Like, Perrin, the things they've told me you've been up to. Lord Perrin of the Two Rivers. What does Mistress Luhan say to that?" "She calls me Lord Perrin," Perrin muttered wryly. Elsbeth Luhan had smacked his bottom more often growing up than his mother had. "She curtsies, Rand. She actually curtsies." Fail eyed him askance. She said he embarrassed people when he tried to stop all the bowing and curtsying. As for his embarrassment when they did, she said it was part of the price he had to pay.
Oh, they're doing
The maiden
Vote
who
by
had
Mail
gone in
again.
squeezed by Rand coming out.
It's another
gave a
big
start.
one.
"Light, I'm keeping you in the door. Come in, come in. Larian,
I'm not allowed
tell
to vote,
Sulin
so I can
I
get
need more
two
punch.
shits.
The melon. And tell her to hop." For some reason, the three maidens laughed as if Rand had said something funny. One step inside the sitting room, a floral scent of perfume told Perrin there was another woman there before he saw her. When he did, he stared. "Min?" The hair in short curls, the embroidered blue coat and breeches were wrong, but the face was right. "Min, is it you?" Laughing, he caught her up in a hug. "We are gathering everybody, aren't we? Fail, this is Min. I told you about her." That was when he realized what he was smelling from his wife, and put Min down while she was still grinning at him. Suddenly he was too much aware that those tight breeches showed the shape of Min's legs very well. Fail had very few faults, but she did have a slight tendency toward jealousy. He was not supposed to know she had chased Callie Coplin half a mile with a stick, as if he would ever look twice at another woman when he had her. "Fail," Min said, holding out her hands. "Any woman who can put up with this hairy lummox long enough to marry him has my admiration. I suppose he might make a good husband at that, once you housebreak him." Fail took Min's hands, smiling, but ooh, that acrid, bristly scent. "I've not succeeded in housebreaking yet, Min, but I intend to keep him at least until I do." "Mistress Luhan curtsies?" Rand shook his head in disbelief. "I will have to see that to believe it. Where's Loyal? Did he come? You didn't leave him outside." "He came," Perrin said, trying to keep an eye on Fail without being obvious. "But not all the way. Not yet. He said he was tired and needed a steading, so I told him one I know of. An abandoned one, north of the road from Whitebridge, and he set off for it afoot. He said he would be able to feel it once he was within 10 miles or so." "I suppose you know Rand and Perrin very well?" Fail asked, and Min glanced at Rand. "For a while, anyway. I met them right after they first left the Two Rivers. They thought Berlon was a grand city." "On foot?" Rand said. "Yes," Perrin said slowly. Fail's scent was changing, the thorny jealousy dwindling away. Why? He would rather use his feet, you know. He bet me a gold crown he would be here in Camelin no more than 10 days after us." The two women were looking at one another, Fail smiling and Min coloring slightly. Min smelled faintly embarrassed, Fail pleased. And surprised, though only a hint showed on her face.
Give me 1 second. I'll
I
be
didn't
right
want to
back.
take his coin. He has to go 50 miles or more out of his way. But he insisted. He wanted to make it 5 days. Loyal always did say he could outrun a horse. Rand laughed, but there had been a pause. Laughter faded. "I hope he makes it safely," he said more seriously. He was tired, and different in other ways, too. The Rand Perrin had last seen in Tyr had not been soft, far from it. But this Rand made that one look an innocent farm boy. He did not blink often enough, as if a blink might hide what he needed to see. Perrin recognized something of that look. He had seen it on the faces of Two Rivers men after the Trolloc attacks, after the 5th, the 10th, when it seemed hope was gone, but you went on fighting because the cost of giving up was too great. "My Lord Dragon," Fail said, startling Perrin. She had always called him Rand before, though they had been hearing the title since Whitebridge. "If you will forgive me, I will just have a word with my husband, then leave you two to talk." She hardly waited for Rand's surprised assent to close on Perrin, turning him so her back was to Rand. "I will not go far, my dear heart. Min and I will have our own conversation about things that would very likely bore you." Fussing with his lapels, she began speaking hurriedly under her breath, so softly that anyone except him would have had to strain their ears. She did recall his hearing sometimes. "Remember, he is not your boyhood friend any longer, Perrin. At least, not only that. He is the dragon reborn, the Lord Dragon. But you are the Lord of the Two Rivers. I know you will stand up for yourself and for the Two Rivers." The smile she gave him was full of love and confidence. He wanted to kiss her right there. "There," she said in a normal tone. "You are all straight again." She no longer gave off the slightest scent of jealousy. Offering Rand a graceful curtsy and a murmur of "My Lord Dragon," she held out a hand to Min. "Come, Min." Min's curtsy was considerably less practiced, and made Rand start. Before they reached the doorway, one of the doors banged open, and a tall, liveried woman entered with a silver tray, holding goblets and a pitcher that gave off the smell of wine and honey melon juice. Perrin almost stared. Despite the red and white dress, she could have been Chiad's mother, or maybe grandmother with that short, curled white hair. Frowning at the departing women, she stalked to the nearest table and set down the tray, her face a mask of meekness that seemed frozen in place. "I was told 4, my Lord Dragon," she said oddly. He thought she might be trying for humble respect, but had something caught in her throat. "So I brought for 4. Her curtsy made Min's look elegant, and she slammed the door on her way out. Perrin looked at Rand. "Do you ever think women are strange?" "Why are you asking me? You are the married man." Rand filled a silver-chased goblet with punch and handed it to him. "If you don't know, you'll have to ask Matt. I know less every day." "So do I," Perrin sighed. The punch was certainly cooling. Rand did not seem to be sweating at all. "Where is Matt, anyway? If I had to guess, I would say in the nearest tavern, and odds or evens whether he had a dice cup in his hands or a girl on his knee." "He had better have neither," Rand said grimly, setting down his punch untouched. "He is supposed to be bringing Elaine here to be crowned. And Egwene and Nynaeve, I hope. Like there's so much to do before she gets here." His head swung like a bear's at bay. Then he fixed on Perrin. "Would you go to Tyr for me?" "Tyr?" "Rand, I've been over 2 months on the road. My bottom's taken on the shape of the saddle." "I can have you there tonight. Today." You can sleep in a general's tent and stay away from saddles as long as you like." Perrin stared at him. The man seemed serious. Suddenly he found himself wondering how Rand's sanity was holding. Might it had to hold, at least until Tarmangaten. He took a long swallow of the punch to wash the bitter thought out of his mouth. What a way to think about a friend. "Rand, if you could set me down in the Stone of Tyr right now, I would still say no. I have to talk to someone here in Camelin, and I'd like to see Bode and the others." Rand did not seem to be listening. He flung himself into one of the gilded chairs and stared at Perrin bleakly. "You remember how Tom used to juggle all those balls and make it look easy? Well, I'm juggling now for all I am worth, and it isn't easy. Samael and Ilion. The rest of the Forsaken, the light only knows where. Sometimes I don't even think they are the worst of it. Rebels who think I'm a false dragon, dragonsworn who think they can burn villages in my name. Have you heard of the Prophet, Perrin? No matter, he's no worse than the rest. I have allies who hate each other. And the best general I can name to face Ilion wants nothing better than to charge off and be killed. Elaine should be here in maybe a month and a half with luck. But I may just have a rebellion on my hands here before then. Light, I want to give her and her whole. I thought of going to get her myself, but that is the worst thing I could do." He rubbed his face with both hands, speaking behind them. "The very worst. What does Moraine say?" Rand's hands came down far enough for him to look over them. "Moraine is dead, Perrin. She killed Lanfear and died. And that's an end of that." Perrin sat down. Moraine? It did not seem possible. "If Alana and Varen are here..." He rolled the goblet between his palms. He could not really make himself trust either woman. "Have you asked their advice?" "No!" Rand's hand slashed a sharp cutting gesture. "They stay clear of me, Perrin. I made that plain." Perrin decided to ask Fail to find out what was going on from Alana or Varen. The two Aes Sedai often made him vaguely uneasy, but Fail seemed to get on well with them. "Rand, you know as well as I do it's dangerous to anger Aes Sedai. Moraine came looking for us. For you, anyway. But there were times I thought she was ready to kill Matt, me, and you." Rand said something, but at least he seemed to be listening, with his head tilted. "If a tenth of the stories I've been hearing ever since Berlon are even half true, this might be the worst possible time to have Aes Sedai angry with you. I don't pretend to know what's going on in the tower, but..." Rand gave himself a shake and leaned forward. "The tower's split right down the middle, Perrin. Half think I am a pig to buy at market, and the other half, I don't know what they think exactly. 3 days in a row I've met some of their embassy. I'm supposed to meet again this afternoon, and I still cannot pin them down. They ask a sight more questions than they answer, and don't seem much pleased I won't give them any more answers than they give me. At least Elida, she is the new Amerlin, if you've not heard. At least her people say something, even if they do seem to think I'll be so impressed by Aes Sedai curtsying that I won't dig too deep." "Light," Perrin breathed. "Light? You mean to say part of the Aes Sedai really have rebelled? And you've put yourself square between the tower and the rebels? 2 bears ready to fight, and you go picking cloudberries between them? Did you never think you might have enough trouble with Aes Sedai without that? I tell you true, Rand. Swan Sanche made my toes curl up in my boots, but at least you knew where you stood with her. She made me feel like I was a horse, and she was trying to decide whether I'd do for a long, hard ride, but at least she made it plain she didn't mean to saddle me herself." Rand's laugh was too hoarse to hold any mirth. "Do you really think Aes Sedai would leave me alone just because I left them alone? Me? The tower splitting is the best thing that could have happened for me. They're too busy staring at one another to turn full attention on me. Without that, there'd be 20 Aes Sedai everywhere I turned. 50. I have Tyr and Kyrian behind me after a fashion, and a toehold here. Without the split, every time I opened my mouth, there'd be somebody saying, "Yes, but the Aes Sedai say." Perrin, Moraine did her best to tie cords to me until I forced her to stop. And to tell truth, I'm not so sure she stopped then. When an Aes Sedai says she'll advise you and let you decide, she means she knows what you should do and will make you do it if she can. Taking up his goblet, he drank deeply. When he lowered it, he seemed calmer. If the tower was whole, I'd have so many strings tied to me by now, I could not move a finger without asking 6 Aes Sedai for permission. Perrin barely nearly laughed himself, and no more in mirth than Rand. So you think it's better to, what, play the rebel Aes Sedai off against the tower? Cheer the bull or cheer the bear? Cheer both, and you will be trampled and eaten. Not that simple, Perrin. Though they don't know it, Rand said smugly, shaking his head. There's a third side, ready to kneel to me. If they make contact again, this isn't how we should be spending our first hour together again, talking about Aes Sedai. Emond's Field, Perrin. His face softened almost to the Rand Perrin remembered, and he grinned eagerly. I only had a short time with Bode and the others, but they mentioned all kinds of changes. Tell me what's changed, Perrin. Tell me what's the same. For a long while, they talked about the refugees and all the new things they had brought. New kinds of beans and squash, new varieties of pear and apple, the weaving of fine cloth and maybe carpets, making bricks and tiles, stonework and furniture more ornate than anything the Two Rivers had seen in a long time, if ever. Perrin had grown used to the sheer numbers of people who had come across the mountains of mist, but it seemed to stun Rand. The advantages and disadvantages of the wall some wanted to put around Emond's Field and the other villages were gone into in depth, and stone walls versus log. At times, Rand sounded his old self, laughing over how all the women had been so hard against Tarabana or Damani dresses in the beginning, and now were divided into those who would wear nothing but good stout Two Rivers dresses, and those who had cut up all theirs for rags. Or how a number of the younger men were growing mustaches like Tarabaners or Damani, occasionally with an Almoth plain goatee as well, which made the unwise wearer look as though a small animal had latched on under his nose. Perrin did not bother to add to that, beards like his own were even more popular. It came as a shock, though, when Rand made it clear he had no intention of visiting the camp, though there were any number of men there he knew. I can't protect you or Matt, he said softly, but I can them. After that, the conversation naturally lagged, until even Rand realized he had draped a blanket over it. Finally, he stood with a sigh, scrubbing his hands through his hair and looking around in a disgruntled way. You must want to wash and rest, Perrin. I should not keep you from it. I'll have rooms set aside for you. Seeing Perrin to the door, he suddenly added, You will think about Tyr, Perrin. I need you there. There is no danger involved. I will tell you the whole plan if you decide to go. You'll be only the fourth man to know the real plan. Rand's face hardened. You must keep that to yourself, Perrin. Don't tell even Fail. I can hold my tongue, Perrin said stiffly, and a little sadly. The new Rand was back. And I will think on Tyr. Chapter 46. Beyond the Gate. Perrin paid scant attention as Rand instructed a maiden. Tell Sulan to prepare rooms for Perrin and Fail, and obey them as she would me. The two Aiel women took that as some sort of great joke from the way they laughed and slapped thighs, but Perrin was staring at a slender man standing a little way down the tapestry-hung corridor. He had no doubt at all that the man was Davram Bashir. It was not just that he was Saldaean, And he surely looked nothing like Fail, with those thick, gray-streaked mustaches curving down to almost hide his mouth. He was no taller than Fail either, maybe a little shorter. But the way he stood, arms folded, face like a hawk staring down into a henyard, made Perrin certain. The man knew. That was certain, too. Making last goodbyes to Rand, Perrin took a deep breath and walked up the hallway. He found himself wishing he had his axe. Bashir was wearing his sword. Lord Bashir? Perrin made a bow that was not returned. The man reeked of cold fury. I am Perrin Ibarra. We will talk, Bashir said curtly and turned on his heel. Perrin had no choice but to follow and to take quick strides despite his longer legs. 2 turnings later, Bashir entered a small sitting room and closed the door behind them. Tall windows let in plenty of light and even more heat than the high ceiling could handle. 2 chairs with padded seats and high, scroll-carved backs had been placed facing each other. A silver pitcher with a tall neck and 2 silver cups stood on a lapis-inlaid table. Not punch this time. Strong wine, by the smell. Bashir filled the cups and thrust one at Perrin, gesturing peremptorily to one of the chairs. He wore a smile behind his mustaches, but eyes and smile could have belonged to 2 different men. The eyes could have driven nails. I suppose Zareen told you all about my estates before you married her. All about the broken crown. She was always talkative as a girl. The man remained standing, so Perrin did as well. Broken crown? Fail had certainly never mentioned any broken crown. First, she told me you were a fur trader. Or maybe it was a lumber merchant first, and then a fur trader. You sold ice peppers, too. He had to start, repeating, fur trader? Incredulously under his breath. Her story changed, Perrin went on. But once too often she repeated something you had said about how a general should behave. And I asked her straight out, and... He peered into his wine, then made himself meet the other man's eyes. When I found out who you were, I almost changed my mind about marrying her. Only she had her mind set, and when Fail has her mind set, shifting her is like shifting a hitch of mules that have all decided to sit down at once. Besides, I loved her. I love her. Fail? Bashir barked. Who in the pit of doom is this Fail? We are talking about my daughter Zareen, and what you've done to her. Fail is the name she took when she became a hunter for the Horn, Perrin said patiently. He had to make a good impression on this man. Being at odds with your father-in-law was almost as bad as being at odds with your mother-in-law. That was before she met me. A hunter? Pride shone in the man's voice and his sudden grin. The scent of anger almost vanished. The little minx never said a word to me about that. I must say Fail suits her better than Zareen. That was her mother's notion, and I... Suddenly he gave himself a shake, and Perrin a suspicious stare. Anger began scenting the air again. Don't try changing the subject, boy. What we are about is you and my daughter and this supposed marriage of yours. Supposed? Perrin had always been good at holding his temper. Mistress Luhan said he never had one. When you were bigger and stronger than the other boys growing up and might hurt somebody by accident, you learned to hold your temper.
Okay.
Right then, he was having a little difficulty, though.
Okay.
The wisdom performed the ceremony, the same as everybody's been married in the Two Rivers since time out of mind. Boy, it wouldn't matter if you had the word said by an Ogier elder with 6 Aes Sedai standing witness. Zareen still isn't old enough to marry without her mother's permission, which she never asked, much less received. She is with Dira right now. And if she doesn't convince her mother she's old enough to be married, she goes back to the camp, probably doing duty as her mother's saddle. And you... Bashir's fingers stroked the hilt of his sword, though he did not seem aware of it. You, he said in an almost jolly tone, I get to kill. Fail is mine, Perrin growled. Wine slopped over his wrist, and he looked down in surprise at the wine cup crushed in his fist. He set the twisted piece of silver on the table carefully, beside the pitcher, but he could do nothing about his voice. Nobody can take her from me. Nobody! You take her back to your camp, or anywhere, and I'll come for her. I have 9,000 men with me, the other man said in a surprisingly mild tone. Are they harder to kill than Trollocs? Try taking her. Try! And we'll find out. He was shaking, Perrin realized, his hands clenched into fists so hard they hurt. It shocked him. He had not been angry, really angry, in so long that he no longer remembered what it was like. Bashir studied him up and down and then shook his head. It might be a shame to kill you. We need some new blood. It's getting thin in the house. My grandfather used to say we were all becoming soft, and he was right. I'm half the man he was. Much as it shames me to say it, Zareen is terribly soft. Not weak, mind. He frowned hard for a moment, nodding when he saw Perrin was not going to say Fail was weak. But soft just the same. And that shocked Perrin so, he sat down before he realized he had moved to the chair. He almost forgot to be angry. Was this man mad, changing about like that? And Fail, soft? She could be deliciously soft at times, true, but any man who thought she was soft in the way her father meant would probably have his head handed to him, himself included. Bashir picked up the crushed wine cup, studied it, then replaced it, and took the other chair. Zareen told me a good bit about you before she went with her mother. All about Lord Perrin of the Two Rivers, slayer of Trollocs. That's good, that. I like a man who can stand toe-to-toe with a Trolloc and not back up. Now I want to know what kind of man you are. He waited expectantly, sipping his wine. Perrin wished he had some more of Rand's melon punch, or even his wine cup undented. His throat had gone dry. He wanted to make that good impression, but he had to start with the truth. The fact of it is, I am not really a lord. I'm a blacksmith. You see, when the Trollocs came... He trailed off because Bashir was laughing so hard the man had to wipe his eyes. Boy, the Creator never made the houses. Some forget it, but go far enough back in any house and you'll find a commoner who showed uncommon courage or kept his head and took charge when everybody else was running around like plucked geese. Mind you, another thing some like to forget is the road down can be just as sudden. I have two maids in Tyre, who would be ladies if their forebears, 200 years ago, hadn't been fools even a fool wouldn't follow. And a woodcutter in Sedona who claims his ancestors were kings and queens before Utter Hawkwing. He might be telling the truth. He's a good woodcutter. As many roads down as up, and the roads down as slippery as the others. Bashir snorted hard enough to make his mustaches stir. A fool moans when fortune takes him down, and it takes a true fool to moan when fortune takes him up. What I want to know about you isn't what you were, or even so much what you are, as what you are inside. If my wife leaves Zareen with a whole hide and I don't kill you, do you know how to treat a wife? Well? Mindful of that good impression, Perrin decided not to explain that he would much rather be a blacksmith again. I treat Fail as well as I know how, he said carefully. Bashir snorted again. As well as you know how. His flat tone became a growl. You had better know well enough, boy, or I'll... You hear me? A wife isn't a trooper to go running when you shout. In some ways, a wife is like a dove. You hold her half as hard as you think is necessary, or you might hurt her. You don't want to hurt Zareen. You understand me?" He grinned suddenly, disconcertingly, and his voice grew almost friendly. "You might do very well for a son-in-law, Ibarra. But if you make her unhappy..." He was stroking his sword hilt again. "I try to make her happy," Perrin said seriously. "Hurting her is the last thing I'd want to do." "Good. Because it will be the last thing you do, boy." That was delivered with a grin, too, but Perrin had no doubts Bashir meant every word. "I think it's time to take you to Dira. If she and Zareen haven't finished their discussion by now, best we step in before one of them kills the other. They always did get a little carried away when they argued, and Zareen's too big now for Dira to put an end to it by spanking her." Bashir put his cup on the table and went on as they started for the door. "One thing you have to be aware of. Just because a woman says she believes something doesn't mean it's true. Oh, she'll believe it, but a thing is not necessarily true just because a woman believes it is. You keep that in mind." "I will." Perrin thought he understood what the man meant. Fail sometimes had only a passing acquaintance with the truth. Never about anything important, or at least not what she considered important. But if she promised to do something she did not want to do, she always managed to leave herself a hole to wriggle through and keep the letter of the promise while doing exactly as she wished. What he did not understand was what that could have to do with meeting Fail's mother. It was a long walk through the palace, along colonnades and up flights of stairs. There did not seem to be many Saldaeans about, but a good many Aielmen and maidens, not to mention red and white liveried servants who bowed and curtsied, and white-robed men and women like those who had taken the horses. The very last scurried along with trays or armloads of toweling, eyes down, and seemed to take no notice of anyone. With a start, Perrin realized that a number of them wore the same length of scarlet cloth around their temples that many of the Aielmen did. They must be Aiel too. He noticed a small thing as well. As many women as men in the white robes wore the headband, and men in the drab coats and breeches, but no maidens that he saw. Gaul had told him a little about the Aiel, but he had never mentioned the headbands. As he and Bashir entered a room with ivory-inlaid chairs and small tables set on a patterned carpet of red and gold and green, Perrin's ears picked up the muffled sound of women's voices raised in an inner room. He could not make out words through the thick door, but he could tell that one of them was Fail. Abruptly, there was a slap, followed almost immediately by another, and he winced. Only a complete woolhead stepped between his wife and her mother when they were arguing. By what he had seen, usually they'd both rounded on the poor fool. And he knew very well that Fail could stand up for herself in normal circumstances. But then again, he had seen strong women, themselves mothers and even grandmothers, allow themselves to be treated like children by their own mothers. Squaring his shoulders, he strode for the inner door, but Bashir was there before, rapping his knuckles as if they had all the time in the world. Of course, Bashir could not hear what sounded to Perrin like two cats in a sack. Wet cats. Bashir's rap cut off the snarling as though with a knife. "You may come," a composed voice said loudly. It was all Perrin could do not to push past Bashir, and once he was inside, his eyes sought out Fail anxiously, where she sat in a wide-armed chair, just where the light from the windows became less sharp. The carpet was mostly dark red in here, making him think of blood, and one of the two wall hangings showed a woman on horseback killing a leopard with a spear. The other was a furious battle swirling around a white lion banner. Her scent was a jumble of emotions he could not separate, and her left cheek bore a red handprint, but she smiled at him, if faintly. Fail's mother made Perrin blink. With all Bashir's talk of doves, he expected a fragile woman, but Lady Dira stood inches taller than her husband, and she was statuesque. Not big like Mistress Luhan, who was round, or like Days Conger, who looked as if she could take over a blacksmith's hammer. She was buxom, which a man certainly should not think of in his mother-in-law, and he could see where Fail got her beauty. Fail's face was her mother's face, without the slash of white through her dark hair on her temples. If that was how Fail would look when she reached that age, he was a very fortunate man. On the other hand, that bold nose gave Lady Dira the look of an eagle, as those dark tilted eyes fastened on him, a fiery-eyed eagle ready to sink talons deep into a particularly insolent rabbit. She smelled of fury and contempt. The real surprise, though, was the crimson handprint on her cheek. "Father, we were just talking of you," Fail said with an affectionate smile, gliding to him and taking his hands. She kissed his cheeks, and Perrin felt a sudden stab of disgruntlement. The father did not deserve all that, when there was a husband standing right there with only one brief smile to sustain him. "Should I ride away and hide then, Zareen?" Bashir chuckled. Oh, a very rich chuckle. The man did not even seem to see that his wife and daughter had hit each other. "She prefers Fail, Davram," Lady Dira said absently. Arms folded beneath that ample bosom, she eyed Perrin up and down without any effort to disguise it. He heard Fail whisper softly to her father, "It depends on him now." Perrin supposed it did, if she and her mother had come to blows. Squaring his shoulders, he prepared to tell Lady Dira that he would be as gentle with Fail as if she were a kitten, that he himself would be meek as a lamb. The last part would be a lie, of course. Fail would spit a meek man and roast him for dinner, but peace had to be maintained. Besides, he did try to be gentle with her. Maybe the Lady Dira was why Bashir talked so about gentleness. No man would have the nerve to be anything else with this woman. Before he could open his mouth, Fail's mother said, "Yellow eyes do not make a wolf. Are you strong enough to handle my daughter, young man? From what she tells me, you're a milksop, indulging her every whim, letting her twine you around her fingers whenever she wants to play cat's cradle." Perrin stared. Bashir had taken the chair Fail had been sitting in, and now he was complacently studying his boots, one propped atop the toe of the other. Fail, seated on the broad arm of her father's chair, gave her mother one indignant frown, then smiled at Perrin with all the confidence she had shown when telling him to stand up to Rand. "I don't think she twists me around her finger," he said carefully. She tried, true, but he did not think he had ever let her, except once in a while, to please her. Lady Dira's sniff spoke volumes. "Weaklings never think so. A woman wants a strong man, stronger than she. Here." Her finger poked his chest hard enough to make him grunt. "I'll never forget the first time Davram took me by the scruff of the neck and showed me he was the stronger of us. It was magnificent." Perrin blinked. That was an image his mind could not hold. If a woman is stronger than her husband, she comes to despise him. She has the choice of either tyrannizing him or else making herself less in order not to make him less. If the husband is strong enough, though, she poked him again, even harder, she can be as strong as she is, as strong as she can grow to be. You will have to prove to Fail that you're strong. Another poke, harder still. The women of my family are leopards. If you cannot train her to hunt on your command, Fail will rake you as you deserve. Are you strong enough?" This time her finger drove Perrin back a step. "Will you stop that?" he growled. He refrained from rubbing his chest. Fail was giving no help at all, merely smiling at him encouragingly. Bashir was studying him with pursed lips and a cocked eyebrow. "If I indulge her sometimes, it's because I want to. I like to see her smile." If you expect me to trample on her, you can forget it." Maybe he had lost with that. Fail's mother began staring at him in a most peculiar way, and her scent was a tangle he could not make out, though anger was still in it, and icy disdain. But good impression or no, he was done with trying to say what Bashir and his wife wanted to hear. "I love her, and she loves me, and that's the whole of it, as far as I'm concerned." "He says," Bashir said slowly, "that if you take our daughter away, he will take her back. He seems to think 9,000 Saldean horse no match for a few hundred Two Rivers bowmen." His wife gazed at Perrin consideringly, then visibly took herself in hand, her head coming erect. "That is all very well, but any man can swing a sword. What I want to know is whether he can tame a willful, headstrong, disobedient—" "Enough, Tira," Bashir cut in mildly. "Since you've obviously decided Zaring Fail is no longer a child, I think Perrin will do well enough." To Perrin's surprise, Bashir's wife bowed her head meekly. "As you say, my heart." Then she glared at Perrin, not meekly at all, as if to say that was the way a man should handle a woman. Bashir murmured something under his breath about grandchildren and making the blood strong again. And Fail? She smiled at Perrin with an expression he had never seen on her face before, an expression that made him decidedly uncomfortable. With her hands folded and her ankles crossed, and her head tilted to one side, she somehow managed to look submissive. Fail? Maybe he had married into a family where everyone was mad. Closing the door on Perrin, Rand finished his goblet of punch, then sprawled in a chair, thinking. He hoped Perrin got on well with Bashir, but then if they struck sparks, maybe Perrin would be more amenable to Tyr. He needed either Perrin or Matt there to convince Samael that that was the true attack. The thought brought a soft, bitter laugh. Light, what a way to think about a friend. Luz Theron was giggling and muttering indistinctly about friends and betrayal. Rand wished he could sleep for a year. Men entered without knocking or being announced, of course. The maidens sometimes looked at her oddly, but whatever Sulin had said, or maybe Mullane, Min was now on the short list of those sent on in, whatever he was doing. She took advantage, too. Once already she had insisted on taking a stool beside his bathtub and talking as if nothing were out of the ordinary at all. Now she just paused to fill herself a goblet of punch and dropped into his lap with a little bounce. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on her face. She would not even try to learn how to ignore the heat, just laughing and saying she was not Aes Sedai and had no plans to be. He had become her favorite chair for these visits, it seemed, but he was certain if he merely pretended not to notice, she would give up her game sooner or later. That was why he had hid as best he could in his bathwater instead of blindfolding her with air. Once she knew she was affecting him, she would never stop the joke. Besides, much as it shamed him to admit it about Min, having a girl on his knees did feel nice. He was not made of wood. "Did you have a good talk with Fail?" "It didn't last long. Her father came and got her, and she was too busy flinging arms around his neck to notice me. I went for a little walk after." "You didn't like her," he said, and Min's eyes widened, her lashes making them look even larger. Women never expected a man to see or understand anything they did not want him to. "It isn't that I dislike her exactly," she said, drawing the words out. "It's just, well, she wants what she wants when she wants it, and she will not take no for an answer. I pity poor Perrin married to her. Do you know what she wanted with me? To make sure I had no designs on her precious husband. You may not have noticed. Men never see these things." She cut off, looking up at him suspiciously through those long lashes. He had showed he could see some things after all. Once she was satisfied he did not mean to laugh or bring it up, she went on. I could see at a glance he's besotted with her, the poor fool, and she with him, for all the good it will do him. I don't think he would even look twice at another woman, but she doesn't believe it. Not if the other woman looks first, anyway. He's found his falcon, and I wouldn't be surprised if she kills him when the hawk appears. Her breath caught, and she glanced up at him again, then busied herself drinking from the goblet. She would tell him what she meant. He remembered her saying nothing at her viewings, unless they concerned him. But if that was so, she had changed for some reason. She would view anyone he asked now, and tell him everything she saw. Yet doing so made her uncomfortable. Shut up, he shouted at Lews Theron. Go away, you're dead. It had no effect. It often did not, now. That voice went on mumbling, maybe about being betrayed by friends, maybe about betraying them. Did you see anything that concerns me? He asked. With a grateful grin, Lynn settled companionably against his chest. Well, she probably meant it to be companionable. Or then again, very likely not. And began talking between sips of punch. When you two were together, I saw those fireflies and the darkness stronger than ever. I like melon punch. But with the two of you in the same room, the fireflies were holding their own instead of being eaten faster than they can swarm, the way they do when you're alone. And something else I saw when you were together. Twice he's going to have to be there, or you... She peered into her goblet so he could not see her face. If he's not, something bad will happen to you. Her voice sounded small and frightened. Very bad. Much as he would have liked to know more, like when and where and what, she would have told him already had she known. Then I'll just have to keep him around, he said, as cheerfully as he could. He did not like for Min to be frightened. I don't know that will be enough, she mumbled into her punch. It will happen if he is not there, but nothing I saw said it won't because he is. It will be very bad, Rand. Just thinking of that viewing makes me... He turned her face up and was surprised to see tears leaking from her eyes. Min, I didn't know these viewings could hurt you, he said gently. I'm sorry. A flat lot, you know, sheep herder, she muttered. Plucking a lace-edged handkerchief from her sleeve, she dabbed at her eyes. It was just dust. You don't make Sewell and dust in here often enough. The handkerchief went back with a flourish. I should go back to the Crown of Roses. I just had to tell you what I saw about Perrin. Min, be careful. Maybe you shouldn't come so often. I can't think Marana would be easy on you if she discovered what you were doing. Her grin looked very much her old self, and her eyes looked amused, even if they did still shine from the tears. You let me worry about me, sheepherder. You think I am gawking at the sights of Camelin like every other country simpleton? If I didn't come every day, would you know they are meeting with the nobles? She had glimpsed that by chance on her way to the palace yesterday, Marana appearing for an instant at the window of a palace Min had learned belonged to Lord Palavar. There was as much chance that Palavar and his guests were the only ones as there was that Marana had gone to clear Palavar's drains. You be careful, he told her firmly. I don't want you hurt, Min. For a moment she studied him silently, then rose up enough to kiss him lightly on the lips. At least, well, it was light, but this was a daily ritual when she left, and he thought maybe those kisses were getting a little less light every day. Despite all his promises to himself, he said, I wish she wouldn't do that. Letting her sit on his knee was one thing, but kisses were carrying the joke too far. No tears yet, farm boy? She smiled. No stammer? Ruffling his hair as if he were 10, she walked to the door. but as she sometimes did, she moved in a gracefully swaying fashion that might not have produced tears and stammer, but certainly did make him stare, however hard he tried not to. His eyes whipped to her face as she turned around. "Why, sheepherder, your face is flushed. I thought the heat never touched you now." "Never mind. I wanted to tell you I will be careful. I'll see you tomorrow. Be sure to put on clean stockings." Rand let out a long breath once the door was firmly shut behind her. Clean stockings? He put on clean every day. There were only two choices. He could keep pretending she was having no effect until she quit, or he could resign himself to stammering, or maybe to begging. She might stop if he begged, but then she would have that to tease him with. And men did like teasing. The only other option, keeping their time together short, being cold and distant, was out of the question. She was a friend. He could as well have been cold toward Avienda and Elaine were the names that came to mind, and they did not fit. Toward Mater Perrin. The only thing he did not understand was why he still felt so comfortable around her. He should not, with her taunting him in this way, but he did. Luz Theron's maundering had grown louder from the moment the Aes Sedai were mentioned, and now he said quite clearly, "If they are plotting with the nobles, I have to do something about them." "Go away," Rand commanded. "Mine are too dangerous, even untrained. Too dangerous. Can't allow them. No, oh no." "Go away, Luz Theron." "I am not dead," the voice howled. "I deserve death, but I am alive, alive, alive." "You are dead," Rand shouted back in his head. "You are dead, Luz Theron." The voice dwindled, still howling alive when it faded from hearing. Shaking, Rand got up and refilled his goblet, draining the punch in one long swallow. Sweat dripped from his face, and his shirt clung to him. Finding the concentration again was an effort. Luz Theron was growing more persistent. One thing was certain. If Marana was plotting with the nobles, especially the nobles ready to declare rebellion if he did not produce Elaine soon enough to satisfy them, then he did have to do something. Unfortunately, he had no idea what. "Kill them," Luz Theron whispered. "Nine are too dangerous, but if I kill some, if I chase them away, kill them, make them fear me, I will not die again. I deserve death, but I want to live." He began to weep, but the whispered rambling continued. Rand filled his goblet again and tried not to listen.
When the Oregon gate into the inner city came into sight, Demira Arif slowed. A number of men in the crowded street eyed her admiringly as they squeezed past, and for perhaps the 1000th time she made a note to stop wearing dresses from her native Arab Doman, and for the 1000th time promptly forgot it. Dresses were hardly important. She had been having the same 6 duplicated for years, and if a man who did not realize she was Aes Sedai became too impudent, it was always a simple matter to let him know who he was being saucy to. That got them out of her hair quickly enough, usually as fast as they could run. Right then all she was interested in was the Oregon Gate, a great white marble arch in a gleaming white wall, the stream of people, carts, and wagons passing through it watched by a dozen Aiel men she suspected were not so desultory as they appeared at first glance. They might recognize an Aes Sedai on sight. Surprising people did sometimes. Besides, she had been followed from the Crown of Roses. Those coats and breeches made to fade into rock and brush stood out on a city street. So even had she wanted to enter the inner city, even had she been willing to risk Marana's wrath by entering without first asking Althor's permission, she would not have. How that did gall, Aes Sedai being required to ask a man's permission. All she wanted was a sight of one Milam Harnder, second librarian in the royal palace, and her agent for nearly 30 years. The library in the palace here could not compare with that in the White Tower, or the Royal Library in Carrion, or the Turhana Library in Bandar Aban, but she might as well wish to fly as for access to one of those. Still, if her message had reached Milam, he would have begun searching for the books she wanted. The palace library might well have some information about the seals on the Dark One's prison, perhaps even catalogued sources, though that might be too much to hope. Most libraries had volumes lying in corners that should have been recorded long ago, yet somehow had remained forgotten for 100 years, or 500, sometimes even more. Most libraries held treasures even the librarians did not suspect. She waited patiently, letting the crowd flow by her, attending only to the people coming out of the gate, but she did not see Milam's bald head and round face. At last she sighed. Plainly he had not received her message. If he had, he would have made whatever excuse was necessary to be there at the appointed time. She was going to have to wait on her turn to accompany Marana to the palace, and hope young Althor would give her permission again, to search in the library. Turning away from the gate, her eyes chanced to meet those of a tall, lean-faced fellow in a carter's vest who was gazing at her much too admiringly. When their eyes met, he winked. She was not going to put up with that all the way back to the inn. I really must remember to have some plain dresses made, she thought, wondering why she had never done it before. Luckily, she had been in Camelin before, some years ago, and Stevan would be waiting at the Crown of Roses, a beacon she could use to guide her if it came to that. She slipped into the narrow shaded gap between a cutler's shop and a tavern. The narrow alleyways of Camelin had been muddy the last time she was in them, but even dry, the deeper she went, the more unfortunate the smell. The walls were blank, with never a window and seldom a cramped door or narrow gate, and those with the look of not having been open in a long time. Scrawny cats peered at her silently from atop barrels and back walls, and stray dogs with knobby ribs laid back their ears, sometimes growling before they skulked off down the crossing run, as alleys were called here. She felt no worry about being scratched or bitten. Cats seemed to sense something about Aes Sedai. She had never heard of an Aes Sedai being scratched by even the most feral cat. Dogs were hostile, true, almost as if they thought Aes Sedai were cats, but they almost always slinked away after a little show. There were far more dogs and cats in the runs than she remembered, and gaunter, but many fewer people. She had not seen anyone at all before she rounded a corner to find 5 or 6 Aiel men coming toward her, laughing and talking among themselves. They seemed startled to see her. "Pardon, Aes Sedai," one of them muttered, and they all pressed against the side of the run, though there was plenty of room. Wondering if they were the same who had followed her, one of those faces looked familiar, that of a squat fellow with villainous eyes. She nodded and murmured thanks as she started past. The spear going into her side was such a shock she did not even cry out. Frantically she reached for Saidar, but something else pierced her side and she was down in the dust. That remembered face was thrust into hers, black eyes mocking, growling something she ignored as she tried to reach Saidar, Darkness closed in.
When Perrin and Fail finally left the interminable interview with her parents, that odd-serving woman Sulin was waiting for them in the hallway. Sweat drenched Perrin, making dark patches on his coat, and he felt as if he had run 10 miles while being pummeled every stride. Fail had a smile on her face and a spring in her step. She looked radiant, beautiful, and as proud of herself as when she brought the Watch Hill men just as the Trollocs were about to overrun Emmons Field. Sulin curtsied every time one of them looked at her, nearly falling over every single time. That leathery face with its scar down her cheek was fixed in an obsequious smile that seemed ready to shatter at a breath. Passing maidens flashed hand-talk at one another, and Sulin curtsied to them as well, though grinding her teeth loud enough for Perrin to hear clearly. Even Fail began to eye her warily. Once the woman led them to their rooms, a sitting room and a bedchamber with a canopied bed big enough for 10, and a long marble balcony overlooking a fountained courtyard. She insisted on explaining or showing them everything. even what they could see. Their horses had been stabled and curried, their saddlebags were unpacked and hung in the wardrobe with Perrin's axe belt, most of the scant contents laid in the drawers of a chest on chest, in a precise array. Perrin's axe was propped beside the gray marble fireplace, as though to chop kindling. One of the two silver pitchers, glistening with condensation, held cool tea flavored with mint, the other plum punch. Two gilt-frame mirrors on the wall were pointed out and touched, one over a table where Fail's ivory comb and brush were laid, and a great stand mirror with carved uprights that a blind man could not have missed. While Sulin was still explaining about bathwater being brought and copper tubs, Perrin pressed a gold crown into her calloused palm. "Thank you," he said, "but if you will leave us now." For a moment he thought she was going to throw the fat coin at him, but instead he got another wavering curtsy and a slammed door as she departed. "I suppose whoever trains the servants doesn't know her job," Fail said. "That was very good, by the way. Polite but firm. If you would only do that with our servants." As she turned her slim back, her voice dropped to a murmur. "Will you unbutton me?" He always felt very thick-fingered undoing her small buttons, half afraid he was going to pop them off or tear her dress. On the other hand, he did enjoy undressing his wife. She usually had a maid do it, because of lost buttons, he was sure. "Did you mean any of that nonsense you told your mother?" "Have you not tamed me, my husband," she said without looking at him, "and taught me to perch on your wrist when you call? Do I not run to please you? Am I not obedient to your smallest gesture?" She smelled amused. She certainly sounded amused. The only thing was, she sounded as if she meant it, too. The same as when she told her mother practically the same thing, head high and as proud as she could be. Women were strange, that was all there was to it. And her mother, for that matter, her father. Maybe he could change the subject. What was that Bashir had mentioned? Fail, what is the broken crown? He was sure that had been it. She made a vexed noise and suddenly began to smell upset. "Randy's gone from the palace, Perrin." "And if he is?" Bending to peer at a tiny mother-of-pearl button, he frowned at her back. "How do you know?" "The maidens. Bane and Chia taught me some of their hand talk. Don't let on, Perrin. From the way they behaved when they heard there were Aiel here, I think maybe they shouldn't have. Besides, it might be good to understand what the maidens are saying without them knowing it. They seem thick around Rand." She twisted around to give him a roguish look and stroke his beard. "Those first maidens we met thought you have nice shoulders, but they did not think much of this. Aiel women do not know a good beard when they see one." Shaking his head, he waited until she turned again, then pocketed the button that had come off when she twisted. Maybe she would not notice. He had gone a week with a button missing from his coat, and had not known until she pointed it out. As for beards, from what Gaul said, Aiel always shaved clean. Bane and Chiat had thought his beard a subject for odd jokes. He had thought of shaving himself more than once in this heat, but Fail did like the beard. "What about Rand? Why should it matter if he's left the palace?" "Just that you should know what he's doing behind your back. Obviously, you didn't know he was going off. Remember, he is the Dragon Reborn. That is very like a king of kings. And kings sometimes use up even friends, by accident and on purpose. Rand wouldn't do that. What are you suggesting, anyway? That I spy on him?" He meant it as a joke, but she said, "Not you, my love. Spying is a wife's work." "Fail!" Straightening so fast he nearly yanked another button loose, he took her shoulders and turned her to face him. "You are not going to spy on Rand, do you hear me?" She put on a dogged look. mouth drawing down, eyes narrowing. She practically reeked of stubbornness, but he could be dogged too. Fail, I want to see some of that obedience you were boasting about. As far as he could see, she did what he said when she good and well pleased, and otherwise not. And forget whether he was in the right or not. I mean it, Fail. I want your promise. I'll be no part of any... I promise, my heart, she said, placing her fingers over his mouth. I promise I will not spy on Rand. You see, I am obedient to my lord husband. Do you remember how many grandchildren my mother said she expects? The sudden change of direction made him blink. But she had promised. That was the important thing. 6, I think. I lost count when she started telling us which were to be boys and which girls. Lady Dira had had some startlingly frank advice on how this was to be achieved. Thankfully, he had missed most of it, from wondering whether he should leave the room till she finished. Fail had just nodded away, as though it was the most natural thing in the world, with her husband and her father there. At least 6, she said, with a truly wicked grin. Baron, she will be looking over our shoulders unless I can tell her she can expect the first soon. And I thought, if you ever managed to undo the rest of my buttons... After months of marriage, she still blushed, but that grin never faded. The presence of a real bed after so many weeks makes me forward as a farm girl at harvest. Sometimes he wondered about these Saldaean farm girls she was always bringing up. Blushers or no blushes, if they were as forward as Fail when he and she were alone, no crops would ever be harvested in Saldaea. He broke off 2 more buttons, getting her dress undone, and she did not mind a bit. She actually managed to tear his shirt.
Demira was surprised to open her eyes, surprised to find herself lying on the bed in her own room in the Crown of Roses. She expected to be dead, not undressed and tucked under a linen sheet. Stevan was sitting on a stool at the foot of her bed, managing to look relieved, concerned, and stern all at the same time. Her slender Kyrian warder was a head shorter than she and nearly 20 years younger for all the gray streaking his temples, but sometimes he tried to behave like a father, all but claiming she could not take care of herself without him holding her hand. She very much feared this incident would give him the high ground in that struggle for months to come. Marana was on one side of the bed looking grave, Berenicia on the other. The plump yellow sister always looked grave, but now she looked absolutely somber. How? Demira managed. Light, but she felt weak. Healing did that, but putting her arms outside the sheet was an effort. She must have been very close to death. Healing left no scars, but memories and weakness were quite enough. A man came into the common room, Stevan said, claiming he wanted some ale. He said he had seen Aiel following an Aes Sedai. He described you exactly, and saying they were going to kill her. As soon as he spoke, I felt... He grimaced bleakly. Stevan asked me to come, Berenicia said. He all but dragged me, and we ran the whole way. Truth, I was not certain we were in time until you opened your eyes just now. Of course, Marana said in a flat voice. It was all part of the same trap, the same warning, the Aiel and the man. A pity we let him get away, but we were so concerned over you that he managed to slip off before anyone thought to hold him. Demira had been thinking about Milam and how this was going to affect the search in the library, about how long it was going to take Stevan to calm down, and what Marana was saying did not really penetrate until the last. Hold him? A warning? What are you talking about, Marana? Berenicia muttered something about her understanding if they showed it to her in a book. Berenicia had an acid tongue at times. Have you seen anyone come into the common room for a drink since we arrived, Demira? Marana asked patiently. It was true. She had not. 1 or even 2 Aes Sedai made little difference to an inn's custom in Camelin, but 9 was another matter. Mistress Sinshonine had remarked on it openly of late. Then it was intended you should know Aiel had killed me, or maybe that I was to be found before I died. She had just recalled what that villainous-faced fellow had growled at her. I was told to tell you all to stay away from Althor. Exact words, tell the other witches to stay away from the dragon reborn. I could hardly deliver that message dead, could I? How were my wounds placed? Stevan shifted on his stool, darting a pained look at her. Both missed any organ that would have killed you on the spot, but the amount of blood you lost. What are we to do now? Demira cut in, directing her question to Marana, before he could start in on how foolish she had been to let herself be caught that way. I say we should find the Aiel responsible, Berenicia said firmly, and make an example of them. She came from the border marches of Shinar, and Aiel raids had been a feature of her growing up. Sionid agrees with me. Oh no, Demira protested. I will not have my first chance to study the Aiel ruined. They'll hardly say 2 words as it is. It was my blood, after all. Besides, unless the man who gave you warning was Aiel too, it seems obvious to me that they acted under orders, and I think there is only one man in Camelin who orders Aiel. The rest of us, Marana said, eyeing Berenicia firmly, agree with you, Demira. I want to hear no more talk of wasting time and energy finding one pack of hounds among hundreds, while the man who set them to hunt walks about grinning. Berenicia bristled a little before bowing her head, but she always did. We must at least show Althor he cannot treat Aes Sedai in this fashion, Berenicia said sharply. A glance from Marana moderated her tone, though she did not sound happy. Yet not so sharply that it ruins everything we've planned, of course. Demira steepled her fingers against her lips and sighed. She did feel weak. A thought occurs to me. If we charge him openly with what he's done, he will deny it, of course, and we have no proof to fling in his face. Not only that, it might be wise to let it be learned that he feels free to hunt Aes Sedai like rabbits. Marana and Berenicia exchanged glances and nodded quite firmly. Poor Stevan frowned furiously. He had never let anyone walk away from hurting her. Might it not be better to say nothing? That will certainly make him ponder and sweat. Why haven't we said anything? What are we going to do? I don't know how much we can do, but we can at least make him look over his shoulder. A valid point, Verin said from the doorway. Althor has to respect Aes Sedai, or there will be no working with him. She motioned Stevan to leave. He waited for Demira's nod, of course, then took his stool. I thought since you were the target, she frowned at Marana and Berenicia. Will you sit down? I do not mean to get a crick in my neck staring up at you. Verin went on while they were still placing the room's only chair and a second stool beside the bed. Since you were the target, Demira, you should help decide how Master Althor is to be taught his lesson. And you seem to have made a beginning already. What I think, Marana began, but Verin cut her off. In a moment, Marana. Demira has the right to first suggestions. Demira's breath caught as she waited for the explosion. Marana always seemed to want her decisions approved by Verin, which was natural enough under the circumstances, if awkward. But this was the first time Verin had simply taken charge, in front of others at least. Yet all Marana did was stare at Verin for a moment, lips compressed, and then bow her head. Demira wondered whether this meant Marana was going to resign the embassy to Verin. There did not seem anything else she could do now. All eyes turned to Demira, waiting. Verin's were particularly penetrating. If we want him to worry over what we intend to do, I suggest no one go to the palace today. Perhaps without any explanation, or if that is too strong, with one he must see through. Marana nodded. More importantly, as things were turning out, Verin did as well. Demira decided to venture a little more. Maybe we should send no one for several days to let him stew. I'm sure watching Min will tell us when he is nicely on the boil, and whatever they decided to do, she wanted to be part of it. It had been her blood, after all, and the light only knew how long she would have to put off her researches in the library now. That last was almost as much a reason to teach Althor his lesson as his forgetting who Aes Sedai were.
Chapter 47. The White Woman. Matt wanted a quiet ride to Abadar, and he got one, in a way. But traveling with 6 women, 4 of them Aes Sedai, he had plenty of irritations. They reached the distant forest that first day with the sun still fairly well up in the sky, and rode several hours beneath a high canopy of mostly bare branches with dead leaves and dry branches crunching under the horses' hooves, until making camp near a dwindling stream just before sunset. Lantern-jawed Harnan, the file with a tattooed on his cheek, saw to getting the troopers from the band settled, the horses curried and hobbled, sentries set, and fires lit. Nerem and Lopin bustled about moaning over not having brought tents, and how was a man to know they would be spending nights on the ground when his master said nothing, and if his master caught his something, it was not his fault. Skinny and stout, they managed to sound like echoes. Vannon took care of himself, of course, though he did keep an eye on Alvar, and even curried the parts of wind that the boy could not reach, even using his saddle for a stool. Everybody took care of Alvar. The women shared the camp, but in a way their area was as separate as if it had been 50 paces away. An invisible line seemed to split the campsite in half, with invisible signs telling the troopers not to cross. Nynaeve and Elaine and the 2 white-haired women gathered around their own fire with Avienda and the golden-haired hunter, rarely even glancing toward where Matt and his men were laying out their blankets. The murmured conversation Matt heard, as much as he could make out, had to do with Vandine and Natalius' concern that Avienda meant to lead her horse all the way to Abadar instead of riding. Tom tried to get a word in with Elaine and received an absent pat on the cheek, of all things, before he was sent back to sit with Julian and James, the stringy old warrior who belonged to Vandine, and seemed to spend all of his time sharpening his sword. Matt had no objection to the women staying apart. A tension he could not understand hung around them. At least, it did around Nynaeve and Elaine, and the hunters seemed to be infected too. They sometimes stared at the Aes Sedai, the other Aes Sedai. He was not sure he would ever become used to thinking of Nynaeve and Elaine that way. A bit too intently, though Vandine and Natalius appeared as oblivious as Avienda. Whatever the reason, Matt wanted no part of it. It smelled like an argument burning to leap out, and whether it burst into flame or smoldered underground, a wise man stepped wide of women's arguments. Medallion or no medallion, a wise man stepped very wide if the women were Aes Sedai. A small irritant, that, and so was the next, which was his own fault. Food. The smell of lamb and some sort of soup quickly wafted from the Aes Sedai's fire. Expecting a quick arrival in Abudar, he had said nothing about food to Vannon and the others, which meant they had a little dried meat and hard cakes of flatbread in their saddlebags. Matt had hardly seen a bird or squirrel, let alone sign of a deer, so hunting was out of the question. When Nerem set up a small folding table and stool for Matt, Lopin was putting up another for Nelisian, Matt told them to share out what he had tucked away in the pack horse's panniers. The result was not as good as he hoped. Nerem stood by Matt's table, pouring water from a silver pitcher as if it were wine, and mournfully watching delicacies vanish down the troopers' gullets. "Pickled quail eggs, my lord," he would announce in a funereal tone. "They would have gone very well for my lord's breakfast in Abudar. And the best smoked tongue, my lord. If my lord only knew what I went through to find honey-smoked tongue in that wretched village, with no time to find anything, and all the best taken by the Aes Sedai." Actually, his biggest grievance seemed to be that Lopin had found potted larks for Nelisian. Every time Nelisian crunched one between his teeth, Lopin's smug smile grew wider and Nerem's face grew longer. For that matter, it was plain from the way some of the men sniffed the air that they would rather have had a slice of lamb and a bowl of soup than any amount of honey-smoked tongue or goose liver pudding. Oliver stared at the women's fire with open wistfulness. "You want to eat with them?" Matt asked him. "It's all right if you do." "I like kippered eel," Oliver said. In a darker tone, he added,
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.